Hi, this is Sam Weigel with V1 Rotate, the web series for new and aspiring professional pilots. This week we're going to talk about 6 things that I wish I'd known before starting private pilot training. It's hot as blazes here in the Pacific Northwest this week, so Don and I are headed up to the mountains for a few days of camping and dirt biking with airline friends. I'm about to fly the Stinson up to Teton State Airport, which was featured in my last V1 Rotate episode. It's about an hour-long flight, so we'll have plenty of time to discuss 6 things that I learned during flight training that I kind of wish I had known from the very start. Obviously, this is aimed at those of you who haven't started flying yet or are early in your flight training. More experienced pilots will probably find these things fairly basic, but who knows, you might pick up a nugget or two.
If you've seen my other videos filmed in the Stinson, you've seen me reaching upward with my right hand a lot. That's where the elevator trim crank is located, as it is on many older Piper aircraft. Most newer aircraft locate their trim knob much closer to hand, and there's a very good reason for that. Early on in my private training, I'd look down to read a checklist or refer to a chart, and my aircraft control would go all to hell. My instructor's hints about trim weren't really getting through to me. I didn't realize I was getting out of trim and using pressure on the yoke to hold my attitude. It turns out humans are pretty bad at holding a constant pressure with their hands, especially when distracted. Finally, my instructor said, "Sam, you gotta trim, trim, and trim some more. Anytime you change anything, you need to automatically retrim. A professional pilot is always trimming." Some 16,000 hours later, I can say that my instructor was definitely right. Professional pilots do trim constantly, so much in fact that we do it pretty much without thinking about it. On the 737, the trim switch is on the yoke, so I don't have to move my hand, I just subconsciously move my thumb and trim every time I change airspeed, thrust, or flap setting. And yet, many students learn trim as a secondary flight control, a nicety to clean things up once the real work is done with the yoke. And consequently, I see fairly experienced private pilots getting out of trim and struggling with aircraft control when their workload increases, especially during instrument training. If you have to hold any force on the yoke for any length of time, you're not trimming enough. Most of the time, you'll be able to fly with light pressure from 2 fingertips. That's it. So, early in your training, get in the habit of constantly trimming, and you'll find the flying much easier. In my last V1 Rotate written piece, I suggested that a fast-paced accelerated program isn't for everyone. But now I'm going to talk about the opposite problem that I occasionally saw as an instructor. Primary students not flying quite enough or flying irregularly and suffering retention problems as a result. I'm pretty convinced that the ideal pace for learning to fly is 2 scheduled lessons a week. For someone who is still working or has other time commitments, this might mean flying once on the weekend and sneaking in an early evening flight on a weekday. It doesn't mean that you'll always fly twice a week because weather and maintenance cancellations happen, but it does mean you'll probably fly 6 or 7 times a month, and you'll seldom go more than a week between flights. By setting a constant schedule right when you start flight training, you're demonstrating commitment to your instructor, the school, and yourself. You'll be able to get on the rental aircraft and instructor schedules a month or 2 out, minimizing scheduling conflicts. Flying 10 hours a month, the average student can finish their private pilot's license in 5 or 6 months, which maximizes your chance of keeping the same CFI before they move on, and in the northern US, gives you a good weather window before winter weather sets in. Another reason that I favor the twice-a-week schedule is that it gives you time to study between every flight lesson. Too many students do not, and as a result, do not learn as much in the allotted time as if they were mentally prepared. I would suggest that if you are committed to learning to fly, you have to give yourself a study schedule to go with your training schedule. If you're flying on Saturdays and Wednesdays, schedule yourself an hour to study on Tuesdays and Fridays. Your study hours should start with a review of what you did and learned on your last lesson now that you've had a few days to mull it over. Use your instructor notes and review any GoPro footage. Next, look at what you'll be doing in your next lesson. If you're learning under Part 141, this is easy, you just look at the syllabus. But even under Part 61, your instructor should have a plan together for your next lesson, and if they don't volunteer it, ask. Read or reread the applicable sections of the FAA's Airplane Flying Handbook or your preferred textbook, and take notes, highlight, make flashcards, whatever helps you remember the material. All throughout my career, I've found chair flying to be a really invaluable exercise. For me, this means sitting in a quiet area, closing my eyes, visualizing the cockpit, and going through the flight from start to end. If you have trouble visualizing, take a high-resolution photo of your training aircraft's cockpit and order a large format poster online. One word on the use of flight sim programs like X-Plane or Microsoft Flight Simulator for study purposes. These can be useful for practicing procedures if you find an aircraft and panel that closely approximates your training aircraft. For practicing maneuvers though, even advanced semiokes and throttles are likely to have the wrong control feel, and you risk developing inaccurate motor memory. Also, unless you have a really high-end visual setup, you're likely to spend more time looking at the instruments than outside visual cues, which is a bad habit that brings me to my next item. When I started flight lessons, I already had several hundred hours logged in early versions of Microsoft Flight Simulator. Consequently, I loved scanning the panel in my humble little VFR Cessna 150. My instructor ended up having to put post-it notes on most of the instruments to force my eyes outside. Nowadays, with glass panels and moving map GPS and ADS-B traffic displays, there's more stuff than ever to tempt your eyes back inside the cockpit. Don't do it. You still need to keep your eyes outside the cockpit at least 3/4 of the time. Why, you ask? Well, first off, traffic on a collision course is really hard to see, and not all aircraft have ADS-B. But the bigger reason is that it's way easier to control an aircraft precisely by visual cues than by reference to the instruments. Even in glass cockpit airplanes with big PFDs, a 1 degree change in pitch is barely noticeable, whereas when you're looking at the horizon through your windshield, even a 1/2 degree change in pitch is quite apparent. You need to look outside most of the time to get really good at flying by visual reference. Once you've mastered that, then your instructor will give you 3 hours of instrument training, just enough to help you out on a dark night, or to help you survive a 180 degree turn if you blundered into instrument conditions. When you're on final approach, you're focused on your aiming point just past the runway threshold, seeing whether it moves up or down in your windscreen, and accordingly adjusting your glide angle with power. But then as you cross the threshold, there's a strong tendency to slide your focus just another couple hundred feet down to the touchdown zone. Problem is, direct vision isn't very good at depth perception, and by focusing so close, you'll have a really hard time judging your flare height, and then whether you're ballooning or sinking. Peripheral vision, on the other hand, is much better at gauging these things. So, when you come over the threshold, slide your focus point way down the runway, almost to the opposite end's touchdown zone. Resist the urge to look closer. Use your peripheral vision. Last week, I took a good friend flying in the Stinson. He's a very experienced pilot who's a captain for my airline, but he doesn't have a tailwheel endorsement and hasn't flown small planes lately. I put him in the left seat for some practice, and on our third landing, he had a bad swerve that he didn't correct, and we came extremely close to a ground loop. I saved it by calling my airplane probably a second or two later than I should have and stabbing the brake. Afterwards, I realized that what I really should have done was call go around as soon as there was any swerve. Looking back on my private training, almost every scary landing I had involved a botched approach or an initial bounce, and in every case would have been prevented with a timely go-around. The thing is, most of us learn go-arounds as that thing you do when you screw up, and so there's a natural tendency to try to save a bad approach or bounce landing. It seldom works, and you end up feeling worse than if you'd just gone around. Let me tell you something that'll make things easier. An approach is a maneuver that ends in either a landing or a go-around, and either is a perfectly normal outcome. I'll go even further and say that a go-around is a valid outcome to all approaches, while landing is only a valid outcome to perfect approaches. If your approach isn't perfect, a timely go-around will just get you around the pattern faster to try again. I hope these tips are useful to you as you start your private pilot training. I'll likely do a few more videos along the same vein for instrument and multi-engine courses in the future. Well, I'm about to get into the mountains here, so I'm going to go enjoy my flying dirt bike adventure. But as always, thanks for watching, and for more great content for new and aspiring professional pilots, Join me here at flyingmag.com every first and third Friday of the month.